The moment my brother-in-law threw his gold-plated fork at my plate and demanded I pay for his extravagant $4,000 Christmas Eve dinner, I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I simply smiled, reached into my vintage leather briefcase, and pulled out a heavy manila folder stamped with the crimson seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had absolutely no idea that I had just sold my private forensic intelligence firm for $600 million. Or that the federal indictment resting in my lap was about to send him to prison for the rest of his life. My name is Nia, I am 32 years old, and this is the story of how I systematically dismantled the toxic empire my family built on lies, debt, and my endless humiliation. Before I dive into the details of this spectacular downfall, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to endure a family that constantly belittled your ambitions, only to prove them spectacularly wrong. Growing up in our sprawling colonial estate in the wealthiest suburb of Boston, my life was defined by extreme contrasts. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were obsessed with projecting an image of untouchable upper-crust perfection. They hosted lavish charity galas, attended every elite country club mixer, and practically suffocated under the weight of their own vanity. To them, appearances were everything, and the truth was merely a minor inconvenience to be swept under the imported Persian rugs. In their eyes, my older sister, Chloe, was the masterpiece. She was the golden child, a stunning socialite whose every minor achievement was celebrated with unhinged enthusiasm. Chloe was groomed from birth to marry well, to smile for the cameras, and to never lift a finger in actual labor. I, on the other hand, was the designated disappointment. I was the quiet, analytical daughter who preferred reading financial ledgers over attending debutante balls. No matter how hard I worked, my efforts were met with sheer disdain. When Chloe managed a C- in high school, my father bought her a luxury convertible. When I graduated at the top of my class, with a full scholarship to a prestigious university, my mother sighed and asked why I couldn't just be more like my sister. I was the scapegoat, the punching bag they kept around, simply to make themselves feel superior. My parents explicitly told me they would not contribute a single dime to my education because my chosen path, forensic accounting, was, quote, unbecoming of a lady, end quote. While they drained the family trust to fund Chloe's impossibly lavish European vacations and her eventual $1 million wedding, I worked 3 backbreaking jobs. I scrubbed floors in commercial office buildings at 3 in the morning. I ate instant ramen noodles for 5 straight years until my hair started falling out from stress and malnutrition. I wore thrift store clothes with holes in the seams, shivering through the brutal Boston winters, while my sister paraded around in custom mink coats. But what they never understood was that their cruelty was forging me into absolute steel. I didn't just become a forensic accountant, I became a predator in the financial world. I possessed a unique, terrifying ability to track hidden money through labyrinthine offshore accounts, shell companies, and encrypted crypto ledgers. By the time I was 28, I was a senior forensic auditor for a federal intelligence agency. But I didn't stop there. I worked 18-hour days, quietly building my own private financial intelligence firm on the side. I developed a proprietary AI algorithm that could detect corporate fraud with 99% accuracy. I called the company Sentinel Data Systems. I built it from my tiny, unheated studio apartment, typing lines of code until my fingers bled. And then, exactly 2 weeks before this fateful Christmas Eve, the unthinkable happened. A massive global cybersecurity conglomerate acquired Sentinel Data Systems in a completely private, all-cash transaction. The final valuation was staggering, $600 million. The money hit my corporate accounts in a single, earth-shattering wire transfer. I went from eating discounted canned beans to being one of the wealthiest self-made women in the country. And absolutely nobody in my family knew. They still viewed me as the pathetic, broke auditor who couldn't afford a new pair of shoes. And they were more than happy to constantly remind me of my supposed failure, especially now that Chloe had married Liam. Liam was a slick, fast-talking crypto entrepreneur who dressed in bespoke Italian suits and constantly bragged about his vast portfolio. My parents worshipped him. They saw him as the pinnacle of success, the perfect match for their perfect daughter. This year, the family decided to host their annual Christmas Eve dinner not at the colonial estate, but at a ridiculously exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. The invitation was delivered to me via a cold, patronizing text message from my mother, explicitly stating that I should, quote, try to look presentable for once, end quote. I almost declined. I almost stayed in my new luxury penthouse overlooking the harbor, sipping expensive wine and ignoring their existence. But a few days prior, while conducting a routine background check for a federal case, a specific name had flashed across my secure terminal. Liam Sterling. What I found in his encrypted financial records was so horrifying, so magnificently catastrophic, that I knew I had to attend this dinner. I had to see the look on his face when I burned his entire world to ashes. I arrived at the restaurant wearing a tailored black cashmere blazer and a pair of vintage diamond earrings that cost more than Liam's leased sports car. But to my family's untrained, label-obsessed eyes, my quiet luxury looked like cheap thrift store attire. I walked into the private dining room, the scent of truffles and aged steak heavy in the air. Chloe was sitting at the head of the table, draped in an obnoxious amount of gold jewelry, her fake lips curled into a permanent sneer. Liam sat beside her, checking his massive, supposedly genuine Rolex every 30 seconds to ensure everyone noticed it. My parents sat opposite them, beaming with hollow pride. "Oh, Nia, you actually showed up," Chloe drawled, looking me up and down with obvious disgust. "I told Mom not to invite you, considering you probably can't afford a single appetizer here, but she insisted out of pity." "Hello, Chloe," I replied, my voice calm, smooth, and completely devoid of emotion. I took the only remaining seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. "It's a pleasure to see you too," Liam scoffed, leaning back in his velvet chair. "Did you take the bus here? Nia, you know the valet out front doesn't park bicycles. You really should have just stayed home in your little apartment. This place is for people who actually contribute to society, not paper-pushing government drones." My father let out a booming laugh, slapping his hand on the table. "Now, Liam, don't be too hard on the girl. Somebody has to do the menial labor in the world. We can't all be visionary tech investors like you." I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my eyes. I just looked at the three of them, the arrogant patriarch, the golden child, and the fraudulent son-in-law. I slowly placed my vintage leather briefcase onto the empty chair next to me. The folder inside was practically glowing with radioactive secrets. "I'm perfectly fine, Dad," I said softly, a genuine smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "In fact, I've never been better." The dinner that followed was a masterclass in psychological torture. Or at least, it would have been if I still cared about their opinions. The waiter, a impeccably dressed man, who looked incredibly nervous around my demanding mother, handed out menus that didn't have any prices listed. This was the kind of establishment where if you had to ask how much something cost, you simply didn't belong. My mother, Valerie, immediately took charge. She ordered vintage champagne that cost more than my first car, imported caviar, and a massive seafood tower just for the center of the table. Chloe demanded a custom-prepared Wagyu steak, complaining loudly that her stomach was far too delicate for standard cuts of meat. Liam, leaning heavily into his billionaire persona, ordered a massive 2-pound butter-poached lobster imported directly from Maine, along with a side of truffles that cost an extra $200. "Get whatever you want, Nia," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sugary sweetness. "I know you usually survive on instant noodles and tap water. You should really experience how the other half lives for one night. Just don't order anything too complicated. Your palate probably can't handle real food." I calmly ordered a simple sea bass and a glass of sparkling water. I didn't say a word as they gorged themselves, loudly discussing their upcoming vacation to the Maldives and Liam's supposed newest venture capital fund. My father bragged endlessly about his colonial estate, loudly proclaiming to the entire restaurant that his historic property was the crown jewel of the Boston elite. "It's all about generational wealth, Nia," my father lectured, pointing his silver fork directly at my face. "Something you will never understand. You threw your life away to work a mundane government job." Liam, on the other hand, understands capital. He's a visionary. He's building an empire that will secure our family's legacy for centuries. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat. "Generational wealth," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is a very fascinating concept, Dad, especially considering how it usually requires actual, tangible assets to maintain." Liam scoffed, pieces of expensive lobster meat flying from his mouth. "Tangible assets are for dinosaurs, Nia. Cryptocurrency is the future, decentralized finance. I'm currently managing a portfolio worth over $50 million. I literally make more money while I'm sleeping than you make in a decade of auditing spreadsheets." "Is that so?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a sharp edge that made the champagne glasses rattle. "Then it must be incredibly exhausting to manage all that imaginary capital, Liam." Before he could respond to my subtle jab, the dinner concluded. The waiter approached the table, carrying a sleek black leather folio containing the final bill. The total, which I could easily read from my vantage point, was an astronomical $4,700. My father didn't reach for it. My mother deliberately looked away, suddenly fascinated by the crystal chandelier above us. Chloe continued applying her expensive lip gloss, completely ignoring the waiter. It was a routine I knew all too well. The family gathered, the family consumed, and then the family miraculously suffered from temporary paralysis when it was time to pay. Liam, sitting closest to the waiter, snatched the leather folio. He opened it, his eyes widening just a fraction of an inch as he saw the final number. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He quickly closed the folio, and with a loud, exaggerated scrape across the mahogany wood, slid the bill directly across the table until it hit my plate. "All right, Nia," Liam announced, his voice booming loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear. "Time to pay up. You've been living rent-free in our heads for years. Consider this your contribution to the family. Chloe and I are saving for our new mega mansion in the Hamptons. And your parents generously covered our flights last month. It's only fair that you cover dinner. Think of it as a privilege." Chloe let out a high-pitched, mocking giggle. "Oh, come on, Liam. Don't be cruel. She probably doesn't even have a credit card with a limit that high. She'll have to wash dishes in the back for a month to pay off your lobster." My Mazar sighed heavily, clutching her pearls. "Naya, please don't cause a scene. Just put it on whatever little debit card you have. If it declines, Liam can graciously cover it, but you really need to learn how to step up and take financial responsibility for your presence in this family." 10 years ago, the old Naya would have completely shattered. The old Nia would have felt the burning heat of humiliation flood her cheeks. She would have stammered an apology, pulled out her maxed-out credit card with trembling hands, and prayed to God it wouldn't decline, knowing she would have to starve for the next 2 months to pay off the interest. The old Nia would have shrunk down, accepted her place as the family ATM, and cried herself to sleep. But the woman sitting at that mahogany table was not the broken, insecure girl they remembered. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't even look at the bill. Instead, I let out a low, steady laugh. It started small, a dark chuckle that echoed from deep inside my chest. But it quickly grew into a chilling, radiant smile that caught them completely off guard. My mother physically took a step back in her chair. Chloe lowered her lip gloss, staring at me as if I had lost my mind. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his confident smirk faltering into a look of genuine confusion. "Pay for your Cecil lobster?" I asked, my voice entirely calm but sharp enough to slice through solid steel. "You want me to pay $4,000 for a dinner I barely touched, so you can save for a mansion in the Hamptons?" "It's about respect, Naya," my father barked, slamming his fist on the table. Do not speak to your brother-in-law with that tone. He is a multi-millionaire. He is doing you a favor by even allowing you to sit at this table. I slowly leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and clasping my hands together. I locked eyes with Liam, letting my gaze drop deliberately and slowly to his left wrist. A multi-millionaire, I repeated, letting the word hang in the tense air. That is a very interesting title, Liam, almost as interesting as your taste in luxury jewelry. Tell me, Mr. Visionary Investor, does your $50 million portfolio know that you are wearing a fake watch? The color drained entirely from Liam's face. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. He instinctively covered his left wrist with his right hand, a defensive, terrified gesture that completely betrayed his guilt. I have no idea what you're talking about, Liam stammered, his voice jumping an octave higher. This is a genuine platinum day-date. I bought it in Geneva. I took a deliberate breath, refusing to break eye contact. Please, I said smoothly, my voice cold and lethal. The sweeping motion of the second hand stutters terribly. The magnification over the date window is entirely wrong, and the platinum finish is already chipping around the bezel. You bought that super fake on the black market, in an alleyway for $300, to look the part of a successful crypto king. Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. Nia, how dare you? Liam makes more in a week than you make in a year. You are just a bitter, jealous, miserable spinster. Am I, Chloe? I shot back, my voice cracking like a whip. Because we both know the ugly truth, don't we? Liam isn't managing $50 million. His supposedly elite cryptocurrency firm hasn't executed a single profitable trade in 8 straight months. He is teetering on the absolute edge of catastrophic bankruptcy. The dining room went dead silent. The only sound was the distant clinking of silverware from other tables. Liam looked as if he was going to vomit right onto his empty lobster plate. You are a fraud, Liam, I stated, driving the words into his chest like nails. My salary as a government drone paid for the exclusive vintage diamonds I am wearing right now, while your entire life is built on maxed-out credit cards, fake watches, and desperate, pathetic lies. Before Liam could even attempt to formulate a coherent defense, my father, Richard, exploded. The veins in his thick neck bulged violently against his starched collar as he slammed both his hands down on the mahogany table. The crystal water glasses teetered dangerously on the edge. That is more than enough, my father roared, his voice echoing off the high, velvet-draped ceilings of the restaurant. Several patrons from across the room turned their heads in alarm. How dare you speak to your brother-in-law with such absolute venom? Have you entirely lost your mind, Nia? I looked at my father in sheer disbelief. He insulted me first, Dad, I replied, my voice steady, refusing to let my tone rise to match his hysteria. He handed me a $4,000 bill, mocked my career, and called me a paper-pushing drone right to my face. I am simply stating a financial fact. My mother, Valerie, stepped right into the fray, her face twisted into a familiar, suffocating scowl of deep disappointment. She waved her diamond-ringed hand dismissively at my explanation, completely invalidating my reality, just like she had done for the past 32 years. I do not care who started it, Valerie snapped, her eyes narrowing into dark, hateful slits. Liam is a respected, visionary businessman. You are embarrassing this entire family with your petty, childish jealousy. You have always been deeply resentful of your sister's perfect life and her incredibly successful marriage. You are just trying to drag them down into the mud because you are completely miserable with your own pathetic choices. My father crossed his heavy arms, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with the man who had just publicly humiliated me. They formed an impenetrable wall of toxic patriarchy, expecting me to immediately surrender. You will apologize to Liam right now, Nia, my father demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, authoritarian register. We are high society people. We do not tolerate your negative energy and your bitter attitude ruining this holiday. You will apologize to him immediately. You will pay this bill, or you can turn around. walk out of this restaurant, and never come back to our estate. I stood there, looking at the unified front they had formed against me. My mother, with her perfectly styled hair and expensive pearls, glaring at me with absolute contempt. My father, a man who cared more about what his golf buddies thought than his own daughter's sanity, fiercely protecting a liar, and Chloe holding on to a man who was quietly bankrupting them, wearing a smirk of victory because Mom and Dad had rushed to her defense yet again. They expected me to break, they expected the old Naya to surface, the one who would choke back her tears, say she was sorry, and hand over her debit card just to be allowed to stay. The old Naya would have done absolutely anything to feel like a part of the family. But as I looked at their angry, entitled faces, I realized I didn't want to be a part of this family anymore. I was not the sacrificial lamb they could slaughter to maintain their illusion of perfection. I took a deep breath, preparing to give them an answer they would never forget. Without a word, I tossed the thick envelope onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack directly on top of Liam's ruined lobster. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger, sounding cold, clinical, and entirely in control. "Open it, read it aloud for the family. Let everyone hear exactly what kind of generational wealth is you are so desperately trying to protect." My father glared at me, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line, but his eyes flicked down to the envelope resting on the table. He instantly recognized the deep crimson ink of the Suffolk County Superior Court seal. I watched the arrogant color rapidly drain from his face, leaving his cheeks a pale, sickly shade of gray. The booming, tyrannical patriarch, who had just been threatening to banish me from his kingdom, suddenly looked like a cornered, terrified animal. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his starched collar, but he made absolutely no move to touch the envelope. When he refused to act, my mother snatched it. Her manicured nails tore through the heavy paper, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. As her eyes darted across the bold black text on the very first page, her hands began to tremble violently. The papers shook so hard, they rustled audibly in the dead silence of the private dining room. "Notice of final foreclosure and transfer of deed," Valerie read aloud, her voice barely a breathy, terrified whisper. She looked up, her eyes wide with frantic, uncomprehending terror. "Richard, what is this? What does this mean?" My father said nothing. He stared at the floor, the absolute picture of a defeated, broken man. "Since the head of the family seems to have temporarily lost his booming voice, I will gladly explain it," I announced, taking a slow, deliberate step around the table until I was standing right at the head of it, effectively taking his place. 8 months ago, the bank finally ran out of patience. You can only ignore past due notices for so long before the creditors come to collect. I turned my absolute attention to Liam, whose smug, opportunistic face had suddenly morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He took a subtle step backward, trying to put distance between himself and my father. "You see, Chloe," I said, not looking at my sister, but keeping my eyes fixed dead on her husband. "Dad didn't just fall behind on the mortgage because of bad luck or a slow economy. He fell behind because he took out a massive, multi-million-dollar secondary loan against the equity of the historic colonial estate. He leveraged the very roof over his family's head to hand a massive lump sum of cash to a man who promised him guaranteed, sky-high returns on a highly speculative cryptocurrency exchange." Chloe gasped, dropping her hold on Liam's arm as if he had burned her. She looked at her husband, then at our father, her face contorting with a sudden dawning horror. "Liam, is that true?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Did you take Dad's money?" Liam held up his hands defensively, his face sweating profusely. "The market was incredibly volatile, Chloe. I told Richard there were inherent risks. It was a liquidity issue, not a total loss. We just needed more time to let the digital assets mature." "Time," I barked, cutting through his pathetic corporate jargon like a machete. "You did not need time, Liam. You needed a miracle to save you from your own staggering incompetence." You gambled away my parents' historic home on a digital Ponzi scheme, and when the margins collapsed, you left them holding the bag. You bankrupted the family trust, you drained their retirement accounts, and you ultimately cost them the deed to the estate. I turned my focus back to my mother, who was now clutching the edge of the mahogany table as if she might collapse. Her perfect high society facade was crumbling into dust right before my eyes. "You knew, didn't you, Mom?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You knew the bank was threatening to seize the property. You knew you were 6 months behind payments, but instead of downsizing, instead of admitting the humiliating truth, you still hosted that lavish charity gala last month. You still bought custom floral arrangements for this dinner. You would rather drive this family straight off a financial cliff than let your wealthy country club friends suspect you were struggling. You cared more about the illusion of perfection than the reality of your own survival." My mother opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of pathetic defense, but only a quiet sob escaped her lips. She looked down at the foreclosure document in her hands, her tears finally spilling over and staining the heavy legal paper. "When the bank finally seized the property, they put it up for public auction," I continued, my voice carrying the steady rhythm of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "They priced it for a quick, quiet liquidation to recover the outstanding debt. My father was desperate. He tried to secure private loans, he begged his wealthy golf buddies for a bailout, but nobody was willing to throw millions of dollars into a sinking ship. He knew the house was gone, he was just waiting for the sheriff to show up with an eviction notice." My father finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a sickening mixture of deep shame and boiling anger. "A private investor stepped in at the very last minute," Richard rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. "A holding company bought the debt and purchased the deed directly from the bank. The bank told me the new owner was allowing us to stay as tenants on a month-to-month lease. We are not homeless." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that caused my father to flinch. "Oh, Dad, you have always been so blindly confident in your own authority that you never bothered to read the fine print." I walked right up to my mother and gently pulled the legal documents from her trembling hands. I flipped to the very last page, the final settlement of transfer, and placed it flat on the mahogany table directly in front of my father. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the bold text, indicating the purchasing entity. "Sentinel Property Holdings LLC," I read aloud, making sure my voice carried to every single corner of the room. "That is the name of the anonymous investment firm that purchased the debt, paid off the bank in full, and acquired the absolute, undisputed deed to the colonial estate." I leaned down, placing both my hands flat on the table, bringing my face just inches from my father's. "I am the sole founder, CEO, and managing member of Sentinel Property Holdings," I whispered, the words echoing with absolute, icy authority. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire family hierarchy being completely, violently inverted. Chloe let out a tiny, stifled squeak, clapping both hands over her mouth. Liam looked as if he was going to be physically sick, his eyes darting frantically toward the restaurant exit. My mother slumped heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs, her legs completely giving out beneath her. My father stared at the signature on the LLC registration, his mouth hanging wide open. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, completely stripped of their former arrogance. He tried to formulate a word, a sentence, a command, but his brain simply could not process the horrifying reality of his new existence. "That investor is me," I stated. "I bought the estate outright with cash. I paid off the massive, humiliating debt that you incurred trying to fund Liam's fraudulent lifestyle. I own the walls, I own the roof, and I own the ground it sits on." I stood up straight, letting the full crushing weight of my power settle over the room. "So please, Dad," I said, gesturing toward his phone with a polite, mocking smile. "Go ahead and call your attorney. Call him right now, instruct him to restructure your estate plan. Tell him you want to cut me out of the family legacy." I would love to see how you plan to disinherit me with a piece of scrap paper when you own absolutely nothing. My father, physically staggered, the absolute finality of my words struck him with the kinetic force of a freight train. He stumbled backward, his highly polished dress shoes slipping against the restaurant's hardwood floor. His hand shot up to his chest, his fingers curling tightly into the fabric of his custom-tailored shirt as he grasped at his heart. His mouth opened, pulling in rapid, shallow gasps of air, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The towering, intimidating patriarch who had ruled this family with an iron fist for decades was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified old man who had just realized his entire kingdom was an absolute mirage. Valerie's reaction was instantaneous and entirely sickening. The haughty, aristocratic indignation melted off her face in a fraction of a second. She collapsed heavily into the velvet dining chair, her hands trembling violently as they flew to her face. She let out a series of high-pitched, breathless sobs, her eyes darting frantically between my father and me. Then, with a speed that gave me whiplash, she lunged forward. She scrambled out of her chair, her designer skirt catching on the table leg, and desperately grabbed for my hand. "Nia, my sweet girl!" Valerie cried out, her voice dripping with a sudden desperate honey that made my stomach physically turn. "Nia, please. You have to listen to me. We are blood, we are your parents. You cannot possibly mean this." I looked down at her manicured fingers clutching my wrist, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I took a sharp step backward, forcing her to drop her hold on me. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "And do not dare call me your sweet girl. 10 minutes ago I was a selfish, ungrateful embarrassment who needed to be thrown out of the restaurant. You literally cheered when Dad threatened to disinherit me. Now that you realize I am your landlord, suddenly I am your beloved daughter? Your love is not just conditional, Mom. It is for sale, and the price tag is absolutely disgusting." Valerie let out a wounded wail, clasping her hands together in a prayerful gesture. "You do not understand the pressure we were under," she pleaded, her tears ruining her pristine, expensive makeup. "We were terrified, Nia. We were just trying to protect the family name. We did the best we could. You must have mercy on us. You have to have a heart. You cannot throw your own mother and father out onto the street. Think of our health. Think of the family." I crossed my arms, looking down at her performative distress. "You didn't think of my health when I was eating instant noodles and losing my hair from stress," I stated plainly. "You didn't think of my safety when I was walking 2 miles in the freezing rain because you drained my college fund for a European vacation. The family name you care so much about was built on lies, credit card debt, and absolute vanity. I am simply the one foreclosing on your illusion." That was the breaking point for my sister. Seeing our mother, the woman who had spent decades placing Chloe on an untouchable pedestal, practically kneeling and begging at my feet, completely shattered Chloe's fragile, entitled mind. "Stop it!" Chloe shrieked. The sound was deafening, a raw, high-pitched scream of pure hysteria that rattled the crystal on the table. She lunged forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Stop begging her, Mom. Get up right now." Chloe whipped her head around to face me, her eyes wide and completely wild. "You set us up," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You deceitful, ungrateful little snake. You knew we were struggling. You knew Dad was in trouble, and you sat back and watched us panic. You bought the estate just so you could hold it over our heads. You deliberately trapped us." I tilted my head, looking at her with a calm amusement that only fueled her rage. "I trapped you, Chloe. You are the one who just demanded a Hamptons mansion with money you thought I owed you. I didn't force Liam to drain the equity of the colonial estate. I didn't force Dad to sign the papers. I simply stepped in and bought an asset from the bank before it went to a public auction. It is called a real estate investment. You should ask your husband how it works, though clearly, he is absolutely terrible at it." Chloe let out another frustrated, animalistic scream and violently shoved Liam's shoulder. Do something, she demanded, her voice cracking with fury. Do not just stand there like a coward. Call the lawyers, call the police. She cannot just steal our parents' house from under them. It has to be illegal. Sue her, Liam. Destroy her. We will drag her through court until she has nothing left. Liam stumbled backward, trying to maintain his balance. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the polished corporate bravado he used to con his investors. He pointed a finger at me, his face red with exertion. Chloe is absolutely right, Liam blustered, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound intimidating. You cannot just swoop in and hijack a family estate. There are verbal agreements in place, there is precedent. We will file an injunction first thing on Monday morning. We will tie this deed up in litigation for years. You think you can just bully us with a piece of paper? My legal team will tear this transaction apart. We will bleed your new company dry in court fees before you even see a single dime of that acquisition money. The audacity of his threat hung in the air for exactly 1 second. I slammed my open palm down onto the solid mahogany table with a force that sounded like a gunshot. The crystal water glasses toppled over, shattering into pieces and sending ice water spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. The sudden violent noise instantly silenced Liam's pathetic bluster. Chloe jumped backward, her eyes wide with shock. I stepped directly into Liam's personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. I was no longer the quiet, submissive girl he had patronized for years. I was a CEO, a federal auditor, and I was entirely done playing games. You want to talk to me about lawyers, Liam? I asked, my voice dangerously low, practically vibrating with a decade of suppressed rage. You want to threaten me with your legal team? Let us talk about your legal team. Let us talk about exactly what happened 7 years ago. Liam's face went entirely pale, he swallowed hard, taking a desperate step backward. But I followed him, refusing to let him escape. 7 years ago I had just graduated, I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. I had spent 6 months drafting a comprehensive business plan, coding the back-end architecture, and designing the entire user interface for a supply chain logistics app. I brought it to the estate to show the family. I made the absolute mistake of leaving my laptop open on the kitchen island. And what did you do, Liam? He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find an excuse, but I did not let him speak. You stole it, I stated, driving the words into his chest like nails. You downloaded my entire project. You slapped your name on my pitch deck. You took my intellectual property to your wealthy venture capital buddies and raised $2 million in seed funding for a product you didn't even understand. And when you inevitably crashed the company into the ground, because you couldn't write a single line of code, you blamed the architecture. You blamed the developer, you blamed me, my mother gasped softly, looking between Liam and me. She had never known the full story, none of them had. They had only known that Liam's tech venture failed, and they had readily accepted his excuse that my coding was faulty. When I found out what you did, I confronted you, I said, my voice rising in intensity, filling the entire private dining room. I told you I was going to the investors to tell them the truth. And how did you respond? You used the money my father gave you to hire a vicious corporate law firm. You sent me a cease and desist letter, threatening to sue me for defamation and corporate espionage. You told me that if I ever spoke a word about the app, your lawyers would bankrupt me. You told me I was a broke nobody, and that the courts would crush me. You ruined my reputation in the local tech scene before my career even started. Liam looked at the floor, absolutely unable to meet my gaze. His silence was a complete and utter confession. Chloe stared at her husband, her face completely blank, the reality of his cowardice finally sinking in. So do not stand here and threaten me with litigation, I warned, my tone absolute ice. You think you can use a lawyer to scare me into submission like you did 7 years ago. The difference is, Liam, I am no longer a broke college student. I have $600 million in liquid cash sitting in a corporate account. My legal team doesn't just send cease and desist letters. They represent multinational conglomerates. If you even think about filing a frivolous injunction against my property, my lawyers will not just beat you in court. They will legally and financially crush you into ashes. I took a step back, letting my eyes sweep over the four of them. The golden child, the fraudulent husband, the manipulative mother, and the broken tyrant. They were entirely stripped of their power, their secrets exposed, their leverage completely destroyed. I will be sending a formal eviction notice through my attorney on Monday morning, I announced, turning my back on the ruined dinner table. You have exactly 30 days to clear your belongings out of my colonial estate. I suggest you start packing. The silence in the room was so absolute it felt suffocating. The only sounds were the ragged, uneven breaths of my parents and the gentle dripping of ice water from the shattered crystal glasses onto the hardwood floor. If this were a movie, the camera would have slowly panned across the wreckage of my family. It would have captured my mother, slumped in her chair, her perfect socialite facade completely dissolved. It would have moved to my father, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant. It would have lingered on Chloe, who was staring at her husband as if she were looking at a stranger. And then the focus would snap directly to Liam. He was sweating profusely, large beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his expensive bespoke shirt. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, an excuse, a lifeline. He knew I had exposed the foundation of his career as a complete lie, but his arrogant, opportunistic brain was still desperately trying to spin a narrative that could save him. "Chloe, baby, you have to listen to me," Liam stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "She is lying. Nia has always been jealous of us. The app thing, it was a misunderstanding. A collaborative dispute, we can fix this. I have new investors lined up in New York. We just need to liquidate some of our shared assets. Maybe borrow a little more capital to float the company for another quarter, and we will be right back on top." I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. I held it up between my index finger and thumb, letting it catch the light of the chandelier. "Liquidate what assets, Liam?" I asked, my voice carrying the casual, effortless authority of someone holding a loaded weapon. When Sentinel Property Holdings purchased the debt on the estate, I didn't just sign a check. I authorized my financial team to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of every single account tied to Richard Wilson and Liam Sterling. "Do you want to know what this little drive contains?" Liam froze, his outstretched hand dropping to his side. The sickly green color of pure terror washed over his features. "Nia, stop," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Do not do this. You think you are broke, Chloe?" I asked, turning my attention away from the pathetic man and looking directly at my sister. "You think your husband simply made some bad investments in a volatile market? You think he just lost a few million in a crypto crash?" Chloe looked at the USB drive in my hand, her eyes wide with a creeping, nauseating dread. "What did he do, Nia?" she asked, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. "Tell me what he did. Your husband is not just a failed businessman, Chloe. He is a desperate criminal," I stated, my words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "When his fraudulent tech company went under, traditional banks stopped lending to him. His credit was destroyed, but he still needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle. He still needed to lease the luxury cars and buy you those diamond bracelets to keep up appearances. So, he went looking for capital in the shadows. Right now as we speak, Liam owes exactly $4 million to a private, unregulated lending syndicate operating out of Chicago." My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Liam, forcing him to shrink back against the wall. "You owe over $2 million to violent, dangerous men who do not send cease and desist letters." "Liam," I said, "they don't care about your corporate lawyers or your golf club memberships. They care about their money. And according to the encrypted emails my team recovered, you missed your last 3 payment deadlines. They are actively looking for you. You are not just bankrupt, you are hunted. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless sob, clutching her stomach as if she might be physically sick. Liam, is it true? She cried out, her voice shrill with absolute terror. Are we in danger? Did you borrow money from criminals? Liam opened his mouth, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. He looked at the restaurant door, clearly calculating if he could make a run for it, before the reality of his situation fully crushed him. But wait, I announced, raising my voice to command the room once more. It gets significantly worse. I reached back into my vintage leather briefcase and pulled out another heavy manila folder. I didn't toss this one, I opened it slowly, deliberately, pulling out a stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs and a clipped bundle of legal contracts. I walked over to Chloe and dropped them flat onto the mahogany table, right next to her untouched Wagyu steak. You have been parading around the country club for the last 8 months, bragging to all of your wealthy friends about your husband's brilliant cryptocurrency portfolio. I said, staring dead into my sister's eyes. Did he tell you why his margins collapsed so violently? Did he give you a technical explanation for why all the money disappeared? He said it was a market correction, Chloe whispered, her eyes glued to the upside-down photographs on the table. He said the exchange was frozen. I reached out and flipped the first photograph over. It was a crystal clear, undeniably vivid shot of Liam on the deck of a luxury yacht. He wasn't looking at a stock ticker or a financial report. He was passionately kissing a stunning, deeply tanned young woman in a tiny string bikini. That is not a market correction, Chloe, I said coldly. That is a 22-year-old former cocktail waitress named Madison. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream, half choke. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and grabbed the photograph. She stared at the image of her husband's hands wrapped around another woman's waist, her perfect manicured nails digging into the glossy paper until it creased. I flipped over the next photo. It showed Liam and Madison walking out of a high-end designer boutique in Miami, his arm draped casually over her shoulders, her wrist dripping with fresh jewelry. I flipped over a third, a picture of the two of them clinking champagne glasses on the balcony of a breathtaking oceanfront high-rise. And then I placed the clipped legal documents directly on top of the photos. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the highlighted closing date at the top of the page. I want you to look very closely at the date on this property deed, Dad, I said, shifting my gaze to my father, who was staring at the documents with a growing volcanic rage. Look at the exact day Liam purchased this $4 million luxury penthouse in South Beach under a blind shell company. Richard leaned forward, his hands trembling as he read the bold print. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. It is the exact same week you signed the secondary mortgage on the colonial estate, I confirmed, my voice echoing with brutal finality. The massive, life-ruining loan you took out to save Liam's business. The money you leveraged against your family's historic home. It never went into a cryptocurrency exchange. It never went into an investment fund. Liam wired your money directly to Florida to purchase a luxury condo outright in cash for his 22-year-old mistress. Chloe screamed. It was a primal, devastating sound that tore through the private dining room. She threw the photographs directly at Liam's face, the heavy paper slicing through the air and scattering across the floor. You disgusting lying pig. She shrieked, launching herself at him. She beat her fists against his chest, sobbing hysterically. You ruined our lives for a cocktail waitress. You let my parents lose their home so you could buy her a penthouse. I hate you. Liam tried to grab her wrists, his face contorted with panic. Chloe, please, it meant nothing. It was just stress. I was out of my mind with the debt. I can explain, it meant $4 million, Liam, I barked, my voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. You stole my parents' legacy so you could play sugar daddy in South Beach, while dodging the criminal syndicate you owe $2 million to. You are a complete fraud, you always have been. A sudden, violent crash echoed through the room. My father had surged out of his chair with a burst of furious, adrenaline-fueled energy. He grabbed Liam's half-eaten lobster from the table and hurled it blindly in Liam's direction. It missed, crashing into the expensive mahogany wall paneling and sending buttery grease splattering everywhere. Richard lunged at Liam, grabbing him by the collar of his bespoke shirt. "I gave you everything," Richard roared, his face purple with absolute fury. "I gave you my daughter. I gave you my money. I gave you the roof over my head. I will tear you apart with my bare hands." Liam shrieked in terror, desperately trying to pry my father's hands off his throat. Valerie screamed, rushing forward and grabbing my father's arm, trying to pull him back before he had a heart attack. Chloe was completely collapsed on the floor, surrounded by the photographs of her husband's infidelity, sobbing so hard she was hyperventilating. I stood at the head of the table, entirely untouched by the physical chaos unfolding in front of me. I looked down at the shattered crystal, the ruined $4,000 dinner, and the absolute destruction of the people who had made my life a living hell. They had called me socially unfit, they had called me a disappointment, and now I owned their home. I possessed their secrets, and I held their entire future in the palm of my hand. The physical struggle finally broke apart. My father, gasping heavily for breath, released his white-knuckled grip on Liam's ruined collar. Liam scrambled backward like a frightened crab, pressing his scratched cheek against the wall. Chloe remained curled on the floor, completely broken. My mother stood trembling amidst the chaos. Her eyes darted wildly around the wreckage of her perfect Christmas Eve dinner. Then her gaze slowly shifted away from my weeping sister and landed directly on me. I watched a dangerous, calculating light flicker in her tear-filled eyes. She had heard the numbers. She had processed the math through her uniquely twisted, opportunistic logic. $600 million in liquid cash, $2.4 million in syndicate debt. Valerie stepped forward, stepping right over a photograph of Liam kissing Madison. She clasped her hands tightly together, her voice taking on a sickly, desperate tone. "Nia, please," Valerie pleaded, her voice trembling. "You said these men from Chicago are hunting him. You said they are violent criminals." "They are," I confirmed coldly. "They break legs and take whatever assets they can find." "Nia, you have to help us," Valerie cried, tears spilling fresh over her cheeks. "Liam has made a terrible mistake, but he is still your sister's husband. If these men come after him, if he goes to prison, the scandal will absolutely destroy us in high society. Our friends will never let us live this down." I blinked, genuinely stunned by her unadulterated audacity. My father stepped forward, his pride swallowed by mounting terror. "Your mother is right, Nia," he rasped. "We cannot let the family name be dragged through the mud. You have the capital, pay the debt, clear the syndicate off our backs. It is only $2 million. You will still have more than enough left over to run your business. Save your sister's life right now." I let out a low, humorless laugh. "You want me to empty my corporate accounts to save a traitor? Just so you don't have to face the embarrassment of your country club friends finding out you are broke? I will not spend a single red cent of my fortune to save a man who actively tried to ruin my life." Chloe let out a devastated wail, burying her face in her hands. My mother knelt beside her, stroking her hair. "Oh, my poor baby," Valerie cooed, shooting a venomous glare up at me. "Look what you have done, Nia. Look at the pain you are causing your own innocent sister." "You can stop the performance now, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through her manufactured sobs. "You are putting on a magnificent show for Mom and Dad, but you and I both know you are not a victim." Chloe froze, her sobs hitched in her throat, abruptly cutting off the theatrical wailing. She slowly lifted her head, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp flash of panic that entirely betrayed her innocent act. Valerie immediately bristled, pulling Chloe closer. How dare you speak to her that way? Valerie snapped, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. She just found out her husband is a cheating, criminal fraud. She is entirely innocent in this. She had absolutely no idea. I didn't break eye contact with my sister as I reached back into the thick manila folder resting on the table. There was one last document tucked inside the heavy paper sleeve. I pulled it out slowly, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. Did you really have no idea, Chloe? I asked, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register. Did Liam really manage to hide over $2 million of syndicate debt and a massive secondary mortgage from the woman who scrutinizes every single bank statement to ensure she can afford her monthly country club dues? Chloe scrambled backward on the floor, putting distance between herself and the document in my hand. Nia, shut up, she hissed, her voice suddenly devoid of any tears. Just shut up, do not do this, do what? I asked, taking a slow step around the shattered crystal. Tell them the truth. Tell them that you knew about the Chicago syndicate 6 months ago. Tell them that you were fully aware Liam was drowning in debt, but you explicitly freed him from bankruptcy because it would ruin your pristine, wealthy influencer aesthetic on social media. My father turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Chloe. What is she talking about? Richard rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. Chloe, did you know about the loans? She is lying, Chloe screamed, scrambling to her feet and pointing a shaking finger at me. She is just trying to make me look bad. Liam lied to me, he hid everything. Liam, who was still pinned against the mahogany wall, let out a harsh, bitter bark of laughter. He wiped the sweat from his cheek and glared at his wife with pure malice. The solidarity of their fraudulent marriage had completely evaporated. Do not play the victim now, Chloe, Liam sneered, throwing her directly under the bus to save whatever shred of dignity he had left. You knew exactly how deep in the hole we were when the bank threatened to repossess the cars. You were the one who told me to find private lenders. You told me you would rather die than be seen driving a leased sedan in front of your friends. You knew exactly where that money came from. Valerie let out a confused, breathless gasp, looking between her golden daughter and her disgraced son-in-law. Chloe, is this true? Valerie asked, her voice cracking. You knew he leveraged our house. You knew he was dealing with criminals. I didn't let Chloe answer. I walked directly up to my mother and held out the final document. It was a bank statement accompanied by a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer authorization form. She didn't just know about the criminals, Mom, I stated, my voice echoing with brutal, undeniable clarity. She actively helped him steal from you to pay them off. Valerie stared at the paper in my hand but made no move to take it. Her entire body was trembling. What are you talking about? She whispered, her eyes wide with a creeping, uncomprehending terror. Liam took the money from the house. Liam bankrupted the estate. Liam took the equity from the house. I corrected her, my gaze locked onto my mother's terrified face. But that wasn't enough to cover his staggering losses and fund his mistress. When the syndicate demanded their first major repayment 3 months ago, Liam was completely tapped out. The bank accounts were empty, so Chloe decided to solve the problem herself. I dropped the wire transfer authorization directly onto my mother's lap. Look at the account number, Mom, I commanded. Look at the origin of those funds. Valerie slowly lowered her eyes to the paper. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the document steady. She read the bold black text, her lips moving silently as she processed the numbers. It was the routing information for her private, untouchable retirement account, the one she had built over 40 years, completely separate from my father's business assets. $500,000, I read aloud, making sure my father heard every single syllable. A clean, even $500,000, transferred out of a high-yield retirement fund and wired directly to an offshore shell account controlled by the Chicago syndicate. Valerie gasped, clutching her chest. No, she whimpered, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, I never authorized this, I never signed a transfer, the bank would never release those funds without my signature. I leaned down, placing my finger directly on the bottom right corner of the document. Look at the signature, Mom. Valerie stared at the blue ink scrolled across the authorization line. It looked exactly like her elegant, looping cursive. To a bank teller, it was a perfect match, but to a mother, to a family member who knew the subtle slants and pressures of that handwriting, the truth was glaringly obvious. That is your signature, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But you didn't sign it, did you? My mother's breathing became ragged. She looked up from the paper and slowly turned her head toward Chloe. The golden child, the daughter she had elevated above all others, the daughter she had praised, pampered, and protected at the expense of my own sanity. Chloe was backing away toward the restaurant door, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide, with the panicked realization that she was entirely trapped. She shook her head, holding her hands up defensively. Mom, I had to, Chloe pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. They were going to hurt Liam. They were going to take the cars. I was just borrowing it. I swear I was going to put it back as soon as Liam's next deal closed. I was protecting the family. You forged my signature, Valerie whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. Her voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. It was the sound of a woman whose heart had just been physically crushed. You stole my retirement money, you stole my future. I did it for us. Chloe cried, tears of genuine panic finally spilling down her cheeks. You always told me to maintain our image. You told me that perception is everything. If people found out we were broke, we would be ruined. I did exactly what you taught me to do. The profound cruelty of Chloe's justification struck my mother like a physical blow. The absolute realization that her years of shallow image-obsessed parenting had created a monster willing to cannibalize her own mother's future just to buy a few more months of fake luxury. Valerie stared at her favorite daughter, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. Valerie, my father yelled, finally snapping out of his shock as he saw my mother's eyes roll backward. But he was too late. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the compounding shock of losing her home, discovering her son-in-law's crimes, and finally realizing that her beloved daughter had actively forged her signature to rob her blind, was simply too much for her mind to process. Valerie let out a weak, strangled gasp. Her eyes fluttered closed, her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed hard against the restaurant floor, slipping into absolute unconsciousness. Richard dropped to his knees beside her, frantically shaking her shoulders and screaming her name. Chloe stood frozen against the wall, her hands covering her mouth, staring in horror at the limp body of the mother she had just destroyed. I stood completely still, looking down at the chaotic, ruined remnants of my toxic family. I felt no urge to kneel. I felt no urge to comfort them. I simply watched the inevitable collapse of an empire built entirely on lies, greed, and favoritism, knowing that I was the one who finally handed them the mirror. I picked up my briefcase, the smooth vintage leather cool against my palm, and turned my back on the absolute wreckage of my toxic family. I didn't wait for them to call after me. I didn't wait for the inevitable apologies or the desperate bargaining that I knew would follow once the shock wore off. I walked out of the private dining room, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut behind me with a deeply satisfying, final thud. The crisp, freezing air of the Boston night hit my face as I stepped out of the Michelin-starred restaurant, and for the first time in 32 years I felt completely, utterly weightless. I handed the valet my ticket, slipping into the driver's seat of my car, and drove back to my quiet, empty penthouse. I had finally burned their fake, suffocating empire to the absolute ground, and as I looked at the city skyline stretching out before me, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never ever have to look back.